Assyria, the first empire of evil. I flayed as many nobles as had rebelled against me and draped their skins over the pile of corpses. Some I spread out within the pile, some I erected on stakes upon the pile. I flayed many right through my land and draped their skins over the walls. These are not the words of a fictional villain from a horror novel. They are the actual boastful inscriptions of Ashurnasirpal II, carved in stone for eternity, proclaiming his methods of rule to anyone who dared approach his palace at Nimrud. Welcome to the world of Assyria, history's first industrial-scale terror state, where cruelty wasn't just a tool of war, but the very foundation of empire. For nearly 3 centuries, from roughly 900 to 600 BCE, the Assyrian Empire cast a shadow of dread across the ancient Near East that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. They didn't just conquer, they perfected the art of making conquest so terrifying that entire nations would surrender at the mere mention of their approach. They were the ancient world's first truly systematic practitioners of psychological warfare, and their methods were so effective that echoes of their reputation still whisper through our collective historical memory today. The story begins in the dusty heartland of northern Mesopotamia, along the banks of the Tigris River, where the city of Ashur had stood for over a millennium as a modest trading post. But by the 10th century BCE, something fundamental had shifted in the Assyrian mindset. Perhaps it was the constant pressure from neighboring kingdoms, or maybe the realization that in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered, half measures were a luxury they couldn't afford. Under Adad-nirari II and his successors, Assyria began its transformation from regional power to ancient superpower. But this wasn't your typical empire-building story. The Assyrians approached conquest with the methodical precision of engineers and the creative brutality of sadists. They studied warfare like a science, constantly innovating new ways to break not just armies, but the very will of entire populations. Their military machine was unprecedented in its efficiency and terrifying in its scope. Iron weapons, siege engines that could breach any wall, cavalry units that moved like lightning across battlefields, these were just the tools. The real weapon was fear, and the Assyrians wielded it with surgical precision. What made Assyria truly unique wasn't just their military prowess, it was their systematic approach to terror. They didn't stumble into brutality. They refined it, perfected it, and turned it into policy. Their kings didn't just defeat enemies, they made examples of them that would be remembered for generations. Take the siege techniques that became their signature. When an Assyrian army appeared before a city's walls, the defenders knew exactly what awaited them. First came the siege engines, massive battering rams protected by shields, mobile towers that allowed archers to rain death from above, and undermining techniques that could bring down the mightiest fortifications. But the physical assault was only the beginning. Psychological warfare was where the Assyrians truly excelled. They would parade previous victims in front of city walls, men who had been flayed alive, impaled on stakes, or had their eyes gouged out. They wanted defenders to see in excruciating detail what happened to those who resisted the Assyrian war machine. Surrender immediately, and you might live. Resist, and your suffering would become a cautionary tale for the next city. The deportation system they implemented was perhaps even more insidious than their battlefield brutality. Rather than simply conquering and occupying territories, the Assyrians would systematically uproot entire populations, marching them hundreds of miles from their homelands to be resettled in distant corners of the empire. This wasn't random cruelty, it was social engineering on a massive scale. By severing people from their ancestral lands, their temples, their cultural identity, the Assyrians created an empire of displaced persons who had no choice but to serve their new masters. The roll call of Assyrian monarchs reads like a roster of history's most effective tyrants. Tiglath-Pileser III revolutionized their military and administrative systems, turning conquest into a repeatable process. Sargon II expanded the empire to its greatest extent, all while perfecting the deportation policies that would scatter the 10 tribes of Israel into historical oblivion. But perhaps no name strikes more terror into the historical record than Sennacherib. Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE became the stuff of legend, not because he succeeded, but because of how close he came to erasing one of history's most significant cities from existence. The Assyrian war machine had rolled through the Levant like an unstoppable force, reducing fortress after fortress to rubble. When they surrounded Jerusalem, King Hezekiah found himself trapped in his capital like a bird in a cage, according to Sennacherib's own inscriptions. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that would ultimately foreshadow the empire's downfall. For all their tactical brilliance and systematic brutality, the Assyrians had built their empire on a foundation that contained the seeds of its own destruction. Fear is a powerful tool, but it's also exhausting to maintain. Every generation had to prove itself more terrifying than the last. Every campaign had to exceed the brutality of previous conquests, and every rebellion had to be crushed with such overwhelming force that it discouraged all future resistance. The administrative burden of managing an empire built on terror was enormous. Assyrian kings had to maintain standing armies that dwarfed anything the ancient world had seen before. They needed intelligence networks to monitor rebellions across dozens of subject peoples. They required logistical systems capable of moving entire populations across thousands of miles, and they had to do all of this while constantly expanding, because an empire built on momentum can never afford to stop moving forward. More importantly, they had created a world of enemies. Every deported population, every flayed noble, every destroyed city created not just fear, but deep generational hatred. The Assyrians were surrounded by peoples who would eagerly join any coalition strong enough to challenge their dominance. They had made themselves so universally hated that their empire became a magnet for every ambitious rival in the ancient Near East. By the late 7th century BCE, the contradictions in the Assyrian system were reaching a breaking point. The empire had grown too large to effectively control, the military was overstretched, and subject peoples were beginning to coordinate their resistance. When Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, died in 627 BCE, the empire began to fracture almost immediately. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal, fitting for an empire that had lived by violence. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes, peoples who had suffered under Assyrian rule for generations, joined forces in 614 BCE and began the systematic destruction of the Assyrian heartland. Ashur fell in 614, Nimrud was sacked, and in 612 BCE, Nineveh, the great capital that had struck fear into the hearts of nations, was reduced to burning rubble. The destruction was so complete that within a century, travelers passing through the region could barely identify where these once mighty cities had stood. The Assyrians had taught the world how to wage total war, and the world had been a very good student. Here's what should keep us awake at night. The Assyrian Empire wasn't an aberration in human history, it was a blueprint. Every element of their system, from systematic deportation to psychological warfare to the industrial-scale application of terror, would reappear again and again throughout history. The Romans studied Assyrian methods. Medieval conquerors copied their siege techniques. Modern totalitarian states have employed deportation policies that would have made Tiglath-Pileser III proud. The Assyrians proved that terror could be systematized, that cruelty could be bureaucratized, and that entire civilizations could be built on the foundation of others' suffering. They demonstrated that with enough organization, ruthlessness, and technological advantage, a relatively small population could dominate vast regions through fear alone. But they also proved something else, that empires built on terror carry within themselves the guarantee of their own destruction. The Assyrians created so much hatred, displaced so many peoples, and made so many enemies that their fall, when it came, was absolute. They had taught the ancient world that mercy was weakness, that negotiation was futile, and that only total victory mattered. When their enemies finally gained the upper hand, they applied these lessons with devastating effectiveness. The last Assyrian stronghold fell in 609 BCE at Haran. With it died not just an empire, but a way of seeing the world that had dominated the ancient Near East for 3 centuries. Yet in our modern world, where we still struggle with questions of power, control, and the price of security, the ghost of Assyria continues to haunt us. The next time you hear about systematic deportations, witness industrial-scale cruelty, or see terror used as a tool of state policy, remember, none of these are new innovations. They are echoes of cuneiform tablets carved in stone 27 centuries ago. when the first empire of evil discovered that fear could be more powerful than any army, and that it could also ensure your ultimate destruction. The stones of Nineveh still lie buried beneath the dust of Iraq, but the methods of Assyria live on, waiting for the next civilization arrogant enough to believe that terror can be tamed and brutality can be controlled. History suggests otherwise.